There goes the song. Welcome to the future of Israel and the Jewish people. We're so grateful that you rejoined us tonight. We're going to start the book of Exodus. Exodus is a book that has so much to do with Judaism. And Lord knows that everybody who is a Jew honors and respects Moses. They don't understand him maybe sometimes, and they don't understand how he went through what he went through sometimes, but everybody holds Moses very high in esteem. We're here again with my good friend John Genoese. John, we're going to have a good time.
Oh, I'm very excited about this, Frank.
Yes, because we feel really so honored to be able to present the Word of God from a Jewish perspective. Why a Jewish perspective? These are the Hebrew Scriptures. This is what Judaism was founded on. This is what we're all about on this show, is to get Jewish people to know their Scriptures and to get Gentiles to appreciate their roots. And for those of you that are neither Jew nor Christian, we suggest you get to know what God is all about through Hebrew Scriptures. So let's talk a lot about Exodus. I don't know how much we're going to cover tonight because there's so much that needs to be laid as a foundation, John. You know, God, after the flood, chose a man. That was Abraham, the father of faith. He's the father of three faiths: Judaism, Christianity, and even the Muslim world, Islam. Well, then we have Isaac. He comes along, and he has two twins, and God more or less chose as a son there, one over the other. And then Jacob comes along, and he chooses a family. And the book of Exodus is going to talk about choosing a nation to represent him.
That's right.
Okay?
We see the progression.
Yeah.
Progression there.
And there's hundreds of years here, I mean, because these people lived a long time.
Yes, they did.
Okay? And so we're talking about probably 1,876 before the current era. Why? Because that's when Jacob was supposedly moved down into Egypt. Okay? Now, they were told they were going to be there 430 years, and I know a lot of times you hear that they were in slavery 430 years. That's not true, okay? Because they enjoyed prosperity for a long period of time, and they grew prosperous for a long period of time, okay? In 1805, before the current era, Joseph dies, okay? Now, Joseph went there when he was 30 years old, okay? And he lived to be 110. So it's a long time that his brothers were with him. They were with him about 77 years. It was about the third year of the famine when they came down and established themselves in Goshen. So that's very important. Well, Pharaoh dies. We're going to read that. And with that, trouble starts. And that's where Moses comes in. Moses is portrayed as the Redeemer. And that's about 1526 before the current era. But the Exodus doesn't take place to about 1446 of the current era. Why? Because Moses is like 40 years when he kills the Egyptian. Then he goes off into the desert for 40 years and marries his wife and has two children. And at 80, he's brought back to deliver the people.
Right.
So if you're over 80 years old out there, you may be ready for your real calling, okay? So don't think that you're over the hill. That's not the way it is, okay? And there's a lot of stuff in this book that has to do with redemption, with the law, with disobedience, wandering, and the covenant being renewed. And that's really important. You know, the main characters in this book is going to be obviously Joseph, The brothers are mentioned, obviously. But you're going to find a great phenomenon in here, is that you're going to find out that when we're dealing with Pharaoh, which is a main character also, it's no longer us Jews, it's no longer Jacob, it's Israel. Israel, okay? It's the Israelis, okay? It's getting back to the core issue, the nation, my nation. And we can't lose sight of that. Moses is obviously the main character. His older brother is the spokesman. He's about 2 or 3 years older than Moses. Muriel, which is still older than Moses by quite a bit, because she's the one who basically introduces her mother to the queen who raises Moses. There's Joshua, and who's the other warrior, John?
Caleb.
Caleb, okay? And then obviously there's the Canaanite people that we're dealing with, which are the people who were living what we consider modern Israel today. So I told you there's a good foundation that needs to be laid. And I'm not going to elaborate much more, but I do want to say that this book is the foundation of Judaism. This is where they were called into a nation. Now, a nation has several things. Number one, it has a leader. In this case, it's God through Moses. Number two, it has a civilization, which is the people themselves, the population. And then there's a land. You don't have a kingdom without territory. And so God's picking the territory he wants his people to live in, his people to control, his people to rule and reign from. And obviously, every nation should have a destiny to protect its own people, to provide for its own people, and to perpetuate the spirit of their nationality, or in this case, it's actually their religion. So, John, how do we start?
Well, it's good to keep in context. When God called Abraham, he said, "In you all the nations of the earth shall be blessed."
Yes.
And so, and I love how the Jewish people, even today, look at Exodus as the story of hope for all mankind who are oppressed. I love how most Jewish people that I speak to don't take Exodus as only their own story, but as a story of hope for all oppressed peoples everywhere. That always made an impression on me.
Yep.
And
Let me say one more thing,
yes,
John,
sir,
before
please,
you go.
Please.
To explain what was going on here, remember, the Jewish people, when they lived in Canaan under Jacob, they were very oriented with their flocks, and they traveled from one spot to another to feed the flocks. So they were nomadic, right? Now the Egyptians was a very thriving civilization. They had already built the pyramids before the Jews ever got there, okay? So it was like a farm boy moving into New York City, okay? They were foreigners, but the Egyptians were citizens. And so, you know, God talks a lot about how you treat the foreigners because they were foreigners, okay? And they worship one God where the Egyptians worshiped many gods, okay? They were wanderers, and the Egyptians were deep-rooted cultured people that lived along the Nile because they couldn't get too far away from their life source. They were shepherds, which the Egyptians didn't appreciate because they were builders. You know, it's like if you live in New York City, you don't go out and milk your cow. You go down to the store and you buy a bottle of milk. You're in a sophisticated society. They lived in Goshen, which was separated from the Egyptians who lived in the Big Apple, we'll call it. So, John, go ahead. let's start off with the book itself, and we'll catch up with some of this stuff.
Okay, Exodus chapter 1. Now these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. They came, each one with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. All the persons who came from the loins of Jacob were 70 in number, but Joseph was already in Egypt. Now Joseph died, and all his brothers and all that generation, but the sons of Israel, just like you said, Frank, it didn't say the sons of Jacob, it said the sons of Israel. Interesting. So you're very, very astute to point out this was the beginning of the nation of Israel.
Sure is.
But the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly and multiplied and became exceedingly mighty, so that the land was filled with them. Now, a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph, and he said to his people, Behold, the people of the sons of Israel are more and mightier than we. Well, that's a hint about the population, right? That's something to remember.
I wonder if they outnumbered them already.
Well, he's saying there are more and mightier than we. I don't know what the literal Hebrew says there, but that would be an interesting study. Come, let us deal wisely with them, if only, right? If only. Mm-hmm. Let us deal wisely with them, or else they will multiply, and in the event of war they will also join themselves to those who hate us, and fight against us and depart from the land. So they appointed taskmasters over them, to afflict them with hard labor, and they built for Pharaoh storage cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread out, so that they were in dread, they being the Egyptians, were in dread of the sons of Israel. The Egyptians compelled the sons of Israel to labor rigorously, and they made their lives bitter with hard labor in mortar and bricks, and all kinds of labor in the field, and all their labors which they rigorously imposed on them. Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah, the other who was named Puah. Only two. For all those people, only two midwives. And he said, When you are helping the Hebrew women to give birth and see them upon the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall put him to death. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt had commanded them, but let the boys live. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, Why have you done this thing? And let the boys live. The midwives said to Pharaoh, Because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife can get to them. So God was good to the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very mighty. Because the midwives feared God, because the midwives feared God, he established households for them. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, Every son who is born you are to cast into the Nile, and every daughter you are to keep alive. Now, if we read that correctly, then Pharaoh commanded all his people.
Yeah.
Now, is that Pharaoh's people? Because if he commanded all his people, every son who was born you are to cast into the Nile, and every daughter you are to keep alive. What does one say to that? What do you say to that?
Well, it's very much like Nazi Germany, okay? When you have a powerful, evil leader, you're fearful of him, and you're apt to do things that are not right. And if you notice this, the whole thing starts off with the word Pharaoh was fearful. See, when you're fearful, that's the opposite of faith. And that's very dangerous, because that's when your emotion gets in the way and you make bad decisions. Okay? We're looking at it back 4,000 years. But what you'll find out is that wherever the Jewish people migrated to, based on treacherous conditions where they were living, They never tried to overthrow the government. They never formed an army. They never, in fact, many times they served in the service of the country they were in. So, you know, I'm sure that we have good examples of that, even in France. When anti-Semitic rose up, it was against a man who was highly decorated in the French army. That's what caused the Zion movement to begin in the first place. So they were good citizens. They were educated. They were prosperous. They were blessing. They were promoting the economy. But jealousy is a very bad thing. And you're always worried about you're going to lose out.
And we see that jealousy already at work. They are greater and mightier than we. Now, this is why I mentioned at the beginning, I mentioned that God told Abraham, every nation on earth shall be blessed in you. Yet the slander that follows the Jews around to this day,
especially this day,
the same slander that though the Jews are out for themselves, they take over every country, they ruin every country. I mean, I was just looking at some websites today. It is appalling that in the name of scholarship, such nonsense. It's devastating. Do you have any other commentary on
Yeah, I
chapter
do,
1?
because we're touching on a couple of things here that's very important, and that is that Abraham was told that those that bless you will be blessed, and those that curse you will be cursed.
Right.
So now Egypt for 70, 100, I don't know, 150 years, were blessing the Jews. The first Pharaoh gave them what they wanted. He said, don't bother bringing anything, I'll supply everything. He said, sure, they want Goshen, let them have it. And so, you know, he was not forfeiting his blessing. But his predecessor did just the opposite. And we know at the end of this book, he forfeited everything, including his life. So it's interesting, too, it says about the midwives, okay? When they protected the unborn child or the child at birth, okay, they were rewarded, okay? They refused to do what Pharaoh told them, okay? Mm-hmm. And therefore, it says God gave them families of their own.
Right, provided households for them.
And being barren in that day was a disgrace.
Oh, the ultimate.
Okay?
Yes.
And not having someone to take care of you in your old age, or to be your heir, or to pass on an inheritance, was like useless. This is exactly what Abraham argued with God when he said, you know, my servant is going to inherit everything I got.
It's true.
And he said, no, Sarah will have a son. And that was Isaac. So, yep. Well, let's move on. Let's see if we can cover some more territory today.
Okay. All right. Just one last comment on verse 22. One is hopeful that what Pharaoh was commanding all his people, saying every son who was born, I know this is going to sound strange, but I find it very hard to believe that he would command his own people to kill their own children because of the Jews.
Oh, no, I don't think he was saying that.
So I believe what he was saying was that he told all his people every Jewish male child that's born is supposed to die. Okay.
Sure.
All right. Amen.
Sure.
Okay, so now I think we'll move on to chapter 2. Ready?
Sure.
Okay.
Chapter 2.
All right, here we go. Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a daughter of Levi. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. But when she can hide him no longer, she got a wicker basket and covered it over with tar and pitch. Then she put the child into it and set it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to find out what would happen to him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the Nile with her maidens, walking alongside the Nile, and when she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid, she brought it to her. And she opened it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the boy was crying, and she had pity on him and said, this is one of the Hebrews' children. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, Shall I go call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women that she may nurse the child for you? Pharaoh's daughter said to her, Go ahead. So the girl went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages. What an amazing providential thing. So the woman took the child and nursed him. The child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses and said, Because I drew him out of the water. Now it came about in those days when Moses had grown up that he went out to his brethren and looked on their hard labors, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. So he looked this way and that, and he saw that there was no one around, and struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. He went out the next day, and behold, 2 Hebrews were fighting with each other, and he said to the offender, Why are you striking your companion? But he said, Who made you a prince or judge over us? Are you intending to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? Now Moses became afraid and said, Surely the matter has become known. When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from the presence of Pharaoh and settled in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well.
Let's hold it up there. That's a lot.
Okay.
Because it takes Moses from an infant all the way up to about 40 years of age.
It does indeed. Yeah, there's
And,
lots of stuff here. There is. I agree.
And I think the important part is right up front. Not that it all isn't important, but, here's a woman who exercises faith, and her faith is rewarded. Okay, it says that without faith, it's impossible to please God. Well, without faith, it's probably impossible to do God's will, too. And her job was to save her son. And so she did what she knew. Now, you got to understand, this isn't a fairy tale. She knew what she was doing, because the Egyptians made like canoes out of the stuff that she made the ark out of. And
Papyri rafts, yeah.
Okay.
Phoenicians did it.
And then you also know that from Noah's day, they used this pitch to seal the seams in the ark that withstood the storm. So there's also, when you think about this little ark that she put him in with a cover on and whatever, probably to keep the sun off him during the day, reflection off the river, she used divine wisdom. But why am I going this way? Well, we know the ark protected Noah's family. This ark is protecting Moses, and the ark in the temple or in the tent of meetings was to make atonement. Okay, you see the remnant pattern showing up here, the Redeemer showing up here. It's all about forgiveness. It's all about God trying to bring people forward that will lead us in righteousness. And he's trying to create a whole nation here to be righteous now. So, you got anything else to say about the infant birth and the deliverance?
Well,
Pharaoh's daughter?
You use the word ark, and I want our viewers to know that the word that's used in Genesis is the word tevat. And it's the same exact word that is used. And the word pitch that's used in Genesis about the ark is the same exact word that's used.
Yeah.
So there's no doubt in my mind that we are supposed to be looking very carefully at the parallels between what happened to Noah and the whole human race and what happened to Moses in terms of what God's plan is, where this remnant little boy who God clearly has a call on his life. So we need to remember that same word. And now even down to his name. His name also reflects that parallel because his name is derived from the Hebrew word, I drew him, Moshe, Mushita, right?
Yep.
His name is from I drew him because she said, I drew him from what? Out of the water. Just as the whole human race was there because God drew Noah out of the water. And I'm struck by that, and I'm going to continue to develop that in my own personal study. We see that Moses, the influence of Moses' mother was profound because he had sympathy for his brethren, right? And we see also that we see the first hints of Moses acting as a rescuer. But interestingly, Frank, we never learn what the Hebrew name given to Moses was, because it was the daughter of Pharaoh that named him Moses. And later on, when God speaks to him, he calls him by that name, not the Hebrew name given to him by his mother. I thought that was profound.
The main thing here we have to learn before we end the show, and we'll continue with this chapter when we start next week, is that Moses was on a divine appointment, and his appointment was being prepared from his birth. I mean, spending 40 years inside of Pharaoh's camp, learning everything there was. This woman obviously was barren. She had no children. I believe history will tell us that her husband had an heir to the throne through another woman, and so she favored her own son, and she made him her son. And that's really important, but it allowed him to be raised in the headquarters of this mighty civilization. And that's the point we want to make. So stay with us, week after week. I know it's a long book. There's 40 chapters, but there's so much you can learn about your faith in God through studying with us. I mean, we're not preaching or teaching to you. If you want to look at our previous shows, it was on Job. You can look at that at www.thefutureofisrael.org or at info@thefutureofisrael.org to speak to us. Now, we're going to continue with this chapter, right, John?
Yes, sir. We have a ways to go in chapter 2. So, but I think that we'll probably begin our next show midway through chapter 2, somewhere around 15, if our audience wants to read ahead.
Thank you for joining us, and try to read ahead so you might see questions that need to be answered in your own mind. Have a good evening. Enjoy our show next week. We'll be here, same time, same place. And thank you. Shalom.